Brittany Cummings. Oh, she's in. Oh, she's here. Looks like we are missing Scott Nelson. Is that how you're seeing it, Jeff?
Correct.
Okay. Well, all those that are listening and watching, welcome to the Utah State Board of Education's board meeting. It's June 11th, 2020. We have an agenda before us. I want to welcome those that are visiting and staff and all the educators and especially our board members. Thank you for making this meeting today. As you know, we have quite a bit of business that we're dealing with during these unprecedented times, and we have an agenda before us. But before we get to the agenda, I want to make an announcement to the board members, and I'll follow up at the end of this meeting. And then Lorraine will send out another notice that we're going to have an additional board meeting next Thursday. That's the 18th, starting at 1 p.m. We still have business to take care of that's not going to be on this agenda. So you guys can mark it on your calendars. There will be an invite that goes out. So I don't think I really need to do a roll call. Who we have on board is Board Member Belknap, Board Member Bolter, Board Member Cannon, Vice Chair Cummins, Board Member Davis, Board Member Earl, Board Member Gravitt, Board Member Haynes, Board Member Lear, Board Member Marsh, Board Member Scott Hansen, Board Member Newell, and Board Member Thorpe. So thank you for being with us. The first order of business here is the general consent calendar. At this time, board members, is there anything that you need pulled from the general consent calendar? Board Member Earl.
Yes, I would like pulled 2.2 and 2.3, just for dialogue and clarification.
Okay. We'll come back to that. So the only thing left on there is our approval of our minutes. So is there anything else that needs to be pulled from our consent? I'm not seeing any hands.
I'll make a motion that we accept our consent calendar.
And that was Board Member Marsh.
Second by Board Member Cannon.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any discussion to the motion? I'm seeing none. So let's vote by checking or hands raised.
Board Member Belknap, yes.
Okay, I've got that. Board Member Belknap. Board members. Scott Hansen, are you yeah, because you're calling in. Board Member Marsh, I'm not seeing a hand or a check, but you made the motion. It appears that the voting is unanimous. I'm not hearing from Board Member Scott Hansen.
I vote aye.
Okay, thank you. Okay, the voting is unanimous on the consent calendar. Board member with items 2.2 and 2.3 removed. So Board Member Earl, let's take on 2.2 first. You had a question? Or?
Yeah, I just want some dialogue about this. I've been talking to Whitney and a couple other people today to get clarification on exactly what this is. And so I don't know if either one of them want to speak to it just to kind of fill us in, or if you want me to just tell
What
you.
is your, do you have a question on it?
Okay, my
I'll
concern
try
is
to
my
answer your
concern is
question.
this. Yeah, we're transferring data to Workforce Department to Workforce Services without the knowledge of the individuals that signed up for the program. So my concern is that I'd like us to notify families prior to and let them choose whether or not they choose to receive the reimbursement for these funds, instead of facilitating that or transferring it to Workforce Services. So it's a data privacy concern.
Okay, and so there was a question in there. So I'm going to see if, trying to navigate this to see if any staff, if Whitney Phillips or does somebody want to speak to that? I can't see hands, so I can't call on them.
Chair Huntsman, this is Kathleen Britton. I can answer that.
Okay, Kathleen Britton, will you answer the question?
Board Member Earl, I had texted you a little earlier. There is a section in the Richard Russell National School Lunch Act that states when they fill out the application, and it's on the application, that this data may be shared with other USDA programs, that they are giving their authority to do that. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, do you think families have knowledge that this is taking place? So I realize they sign that, but when they're signing a school lunch paper, and that's my concern, I'd rather we notified them that they could qualify and allow them to go through the process, then send it to Workforce Services and allow them to do the process for us. So, or at that, providing them the minimal amount of information so they can talk to families, and families can then provide, families can then decide whether or not to participate.
This is something that DWS is the lead on this, not USBE. So they would have to dictate that. And currently the pressure and the time frame is a quick turnaround right now for them. And this is how they have proposed to do it. I did talk to them earlier, and they did say that a parent can choose to opt out. When they receive the benefits, they can just call them and then cancel the card.
Yeah, and just background for the whole board. This is Superintendent Dixon, if I may.
Yes,
Mr.
Superintendent.
Yeah, and just some additional background. So there are 43 states who have applied for this grant or this program, and you might have seen this played out a bit in social media and other places as to why we didn't apply for the grant, but it was this data sharing agreement that we didn't have in place. A lot of states have systems that just talk to each other, and we did not have a system in place. And so there were a lot of states who contacted the federal government in regards to this grant to let them know that it was untenable based on the requirements of the grant. So by having this sharing agreement, it allows the state of Utah to apply for these additional funds where they can use their EBT card, and what that stands for is escaping me. Kathleen, you probably know.
Electronic benefit transfer.
Thank you. So it expands that so that families can get additional food. So I just want to make sure that the board knows what the grant is for, and it would come from the Department of Workforce Services. But one of the ways they account for that are for kiddos who qualify for free and reduced lunch based on the economic status of the family.
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Yes, you bet.
Yeah. Now these are new students to the program. These aren't students that already are receiving funds through Workforce Services. So this is us sending information for people to become eligible for this. In other words, they're not already in their system. Is that accurate, or am I misled in that?
That is correct.
Okay.
So it provides for additional families that are not already
In
receiving
the system.
free or reduced meals.
And it's just a one-time benefit for the last 54 days of school.
Sorry, I can't tell if I'm on or off now.
You're on. So
Okay,
do you have
so
any other
it's a
questions?
reimbursement. It's a reimbursement for the breakfast and lunch program just in case they didn't get breakfast and lunch at the school. Is that accurate? And these would be new individuals. We're sending information. There'd be new individuals coming in the program. Okay, so I'm good. We can make a motion. I don't know if
You want to make a motion on that item under general consent under 2.2?
Sure. Sorry, I don't have it right in the wording exactly in front of me.
Okay, so maybe I can say it and you can agree. I'll help out. So I'm seeking a motion under the general consent calendar under 2.2 that we approve the data sharing agreement request. You could say so moved if you'd like.
Okay, so moved.
Okay, is there a second?
Second, Board Member Lear.
Okay, thank you. Is there any discussion to the motion? I'm not seeing any hands, so let's vote by either check or.
Board Member Belknap, aye.
Okay, thank you. And Board Member
Hanson, vote aye.
Okay, thank you. Okay, it appears the voting is unanimous. So the motion passes. Board Member Earl, you had a question on.
Mine, I did not vote for it. I don't want this data shared in this way, so I'm going to X.
Okay, let me see if I can find you in here. Oh, there it is. Thank you. So it didn't pass unanimously. It passed with one exception, Board Member Bolter.
Board Member Bolter and Board Member Earl are both no's.
Vice Chair Brittany Cummings, I need you to rescue me now and again because I'm trying to inventory these.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, Board Member Bolter, Board Member Earl are both no's. The rest are ayes, so the motion passes with
Okay.
2 no's.
Okay, so the motion passes with, yeah, and I'm counting Board Member Belknap and then also Board Member Hanson with a voice vote of aye. Okay, motion passes. Okay, Board Member Earl.
My
you had a
question on this.
2.3.
Yes, did this go through a committee? I was wanting to know more detail as to the actual programming that they're recommending, but I didn't see very many details within the actual information document that we are co-signing onto. So I'm just wondering if did that go through a committee? That's maybe my question.
Okay, and I'm looking, does somebody want to weigh in? Because I'm looking for hands from staff.
So this is Tiffany.
Okay, Tiffany Stanley. Okay.
Thanks.
Tiffany.
Tiffany Stanley, Chief of Staff. So no, this is an information item related to an opportunity to co-sponsor a couple of pieces related to community resources and supports for bridging learning gaps, specifically around encouragement to read over the summer with your child. And then the other piece is educator innovation award that we would co-sponsor the awards.
So, Tiffany, you're breaking up on my end. Is everyone else hearing Tiffany okay? Was you able to hear that response, Board Member Earl?
Yeah. Am I on still?
Yes.
Yes, I was. Maybe I could ask a specific question here. So it's
Yes,
saying provide learning resources via campaign website. I'm just wondering, is there a place where we as board members could go see what the resources are that we're co-signing on to? Or is that just done through this partnership with United Way of Salt Lake? Are they're facilitating it and we're just co-signing on? Am I understanding that right?
Yeah, so I'm not sure they've curated those resources yet. They are doing so in collaboration with a group through the Promise Partnership, which includes school districts. And I know that we have at least one staff member that is represented in that group. So that's kind of the process they're going through to identify those resources.
Okay, so Will that come back to us, or can that be information be forwarded on to us somehow?
I imagine so. I guess the only challenge would be timing, given timing of board meetings, but we could definitely, given this is an information item, we could definitely forward those by email.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily asking that we have to vote on them, that kind of a thing. I would like to be aware of it if we're co-signing is all.
Yes.
So, okay, thank you.
And that's why it's an information item, to just make sure we're all aware of this particular opportunity for partnership. So the organization isn't asking today anything of USBE, the way that I view this. But this would not require any action or anything, because this was informational. Okay, anything else on this particular item, Board Member Earl?
No, I just wanted to know the programming. Thank you.
You bet. Okay, next we are a little bit behind on a time certain, which is hopefully Senator Fillmore is okay with it. Item number 3 is a resolution. Senator Fillmore, are you on?
I am on. Can you hear me?
Welcome, Senator. Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. I see that you've got the draft of this proposed legislation before you, and I say legislation. It's a resolution. You know, as we were nearing the end of this very odd school year and this very circumstance, working with legislative leadership and the superintendency at the State Board of Education, we just wanted to be able to do something to recognize the graduates of the class of 2020 who will be graduating in a circumstance unlike any that has ever been seen before. So we've crafted this resolution that we intend to present to the full legislature in a special session next week. And at the superintendent's request, we're here presenting that to the board to get your feedback and hopefully to be able to get your endorsement. It's a fairly simple resolution that just outlines some of the challenges that schools and students have faced over the last several months, and particularly with regard to seniors in the class of 2020. All of the cultural and personal milestones that just are marked in a traditional way, that they don't get to go to senior prom. They don't have a yearbook day. Their graduation ceremonies, if they had them, were so different. And we just wanted to recognize that fact and let the graduating class of 2020 know that even though this is a difficult circumstance, we just have such full confidence in their ability to continue to on their path to be the leaders that Utah needs in the future. Many of these graduates will be board members and legislators and teachers and business owners in the future. And we just wanted to let them all know how much we appreciate what they did, and that in lieu of some of those traditional ways that we mark those milestones, that we could at least as a state, as a legislature and the governor and the State Board of Education come together to show our appreciation and confidence in the class of 2020.
So very well said. And then we've had this working draft before us. And so board members, do you have any questions of the good senator on this? And then like the senator said, this does create an opportunity where the board could support this, and I could hear in the beginning support or ask at this time if there's anyone that wants to make a motion that the board support the concurrent resolution honoring the graduating class of 2020.
I'm fine. Let's keep praying. Yeah.
Okay, so hold it. Was that a board member weighing in on this? I could seek a motion.
Chair, I have a question.
Or we can get into some questions. Yes, Vice Chair Brittany.
Yeah. Um, I was wondering if Senator Fillmore would be willing to just speak to the last part of the resolution where it's encouraging ceremonies at a later date. Just kind of the intent and what your thoughts are on that. Is it because you feel that what has been done isn't sufficient, or what are your thoughts? What was the purpose for adding that last portion? Thank you.
I'll go ahead and respond, Mr. Chair, if that's all right.
Yes, please.
Yeah. And thank you, Ms. Cummings. It's good to talk to you. This was started, the draft of this was started before some school districts, launched kind of, what you might call drive-through graduation ceremonies. The point of this is really just to encourage local education agencies at their discretion, but it provides encouragement for them to do something to be able to mark this event for their graduates when that becomes possible. And I know that for some school districts that has already been possible, and they've already done such graduation ceremonies. Although I wouldn't be opposed if LEAs got together and decided, or schools got together and decided that they wanted to, when social distancing isn't quite the concern that it is today, to bring graduates together at the school for something that allows them to get together and say goodbye to each other, wish each other well in the future. So this resolution simply encourages schools and school districts and charter schools to find ways to accomplish that when restrictions are loosened to the point that that's possible.
You have a follow-up?
Thank you. No, thank you very much.
Chair Huntsman, Board Member Belknap.
Board Member Belknap.
Yes, Senator Fillmore, I want to follow up on Brittany's question because I'm not sure that there's a school and or a district that hasn't done some sort of celebration already. And my fear is that we are now kind of telling them to do something where they've already either budgeted and or made the experience as good as possible. Is there a way to restate that so that it is not sounding like we expect them to do something?
Of course, there is a way. Would you, are you suggesting that we strike that paragraph, or do you have new wording that you would suggest?
Well, I appreciate that, Lincoln. I'm not sure because I don't have it right in front of me because I'm on the phone, but maybe Brittany could help me here that we either, I don't want to be presumptuous and say that this absolutely needs to be stricken, but I'm not sure that there's a district that hasn't done what they needed to already, and I'm not sure that there's a senior who wants to come back in August and try and figure this out again, or October. So, yes, if someone could help me with verbiage, I'd love that.
So let me, for the benefit of those that aren't seeing it on their screen, Board Member Belknap, it reads on line 51, be it further resolved that the legislature and governor encourage local education agencies to hold a ceremony marking high school graduation with when circumstances and guidance allowed. That's how it reads. It has the word encourage. It's not a shall or must or may. That was the direction.
I appreciate that. I just think, Dr. Dixon, maybe you could help me. Is there any school that you know of or can think of, or school district or charter that has not already done this celebration to the best of their ability for these years?
I am unaware of anybody who have not done something. I don't know if there are those who have something in addition planned. When plans were initially being made, I did hear a couple of charters and one district who was thinking about holding a date in the fall, but I'm not sure the status of that now. I've heard people being pleasantly surprised at how comprehensive the celebrations were. So we could easily survey LEAs to see if they're still planning on a later date or have the opportunity to. I think part of it might also be about funds, because I know that while they didn't have in-person, many of them did not have in-person graduations, they did have walkthroughs and a lot of things that cost them additional. There were additional costs associated with it. Excuse me. So we could easily do a survey and find out.
Questions? Board Member Davis? Oh, no, I thought I saw a hand.
I was just going to say, I wish this came around about 2 months ago, because that's when there was the real quandary of, do we celebrate or do we not? And I think it's pretty much done now. It's over. And I hate to send a message to LEAs that what they did maybe perhaps wasn't enough, and now they've got to figure out something else they need to do on top. I know in our area, even some people did fireworks and things. So I hate to send a muddy message. I just wish it was earlier on.
Okay, Board Member Marsh?
Thank you, Board Chair. I'm kind of in agreement with those Cindy and Board Member Belknap and them that have spoke earlier. The districts that have gone overboard to do as much as they could to recognize them for the great work that they've done. I think one thing that, as I have viewed it, that kids miss, they say, well, we not getting what everybody else got. And I kind of reverse that and say, but you're graduating in a way that nobody has ever done before in their life and may never ever do again. This is like man stepping on the moon. Nobody's done that. You guys need to realize that, no, you're not like everybody else. You're special. You're set aside. You're in the history books. But anyway, you're going to have a lot of kids that are playing fall sports at colleges. You got kids that are leaving on missions. You got kids that are moving out of state to go to school, period. I just think it'd be really hard to encourage them to have something and then have it late enough in the year that some of the kids, or a good majority of them, are already gone and won't come back for it. So I would think that it would probably do good to kind of move that out of the resolution, if we could, please.
So it seems like from line 51 to 53 seems to be the big question here.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
I wonder if I could short circuit this by simply saying that perhaps a good way to change that, since events have kind of overtaken this drafting before a special session next week, is that we could just further resolve that the legislature and the governor congratulate local education agencies on the ceremonies they held marking graduation when circumcised, right? We'll just change the wording to acknowledge the fact that these have already happened and thank the schools for doing so.
Thank you, Lincoln.
Yes, thank you. So I guess the question is as Senator Fillmore is taking this with what he just stated, is the board in support of his last statement and the direction that he is going with this resolution? Vice Chair Brittany Cummings?
Yeah, I'd like to make a motion, Chair.
Okay. Hopefully I can keep track of it here. Unless
Okay.
it's going to show up on the screen.
I move that the board support the concurrent resolution honoring the graduating class of 2020 with the suggested changes to line 51 to 53.
Second, Board Member Belknap.
Okay, discussion to the motion. And panning. I am not seeing any hands. So the motion before the board is that the board support the concurrent resolution honoring the graduating class of 2020 with the substitute changes to lines 51 from 51 to 53. Okay, we're going to vote on this. All in favor, please vote.
Hanson votes aye.
Board Member Belknap, you're aye.
Yes.
Board Member Scott Hanson,
Also an aye.
Okay. Okay, the voting is complete, and it is unanimous. Is that how you see it, Vice Chair Cummings?
Yes.
Thank you, Senator Fillmore. Do you have a closing comment?
I thank the board for its comment. I think the resolution is going to be better for this, and I appreciate it. Appreciate your time.
Thank you. Take care and be safe.
Thank you.
Okay. Next is the superintendent's report. Superintendent Dixon, are you ready to come online?
I am. Thank you, Mr. Chair. We've had the opportunity to engage with, so I'll get my camera on here.
I'll turn mine off.
No.
The thorn, a thorn among roses here, so.
I got it on there. We have been meeting with local, state health, and 4 board members on a couple of calls to talk about the way forward in terms of providing requirements and recommendations for our LEAs. You might recall at our board meeting last week, we discussed the desire of our principals, our system leaders, our superintendents, our charter directors to have something more succinct that they can rely on. And we've heard them use terms like standards, requirements, guardrails, so that they then know where they have the flexibility therein. And we also outlined the process a little bit with Utah Leads. The 4 board members representing you on this group are Jenny Gravitt, Jenny Earl, Carol Lear, and Scott Hansen. And Chair Huntsman joined us yesterday, which we appreciated. One of the things that we learned about that for me was very helpful was thinking about the sifting process of how decisions have been made going into the Utah Leads document. And I appreciated John Pullman from the Levitt Group talking about that document comes about from a variety of things, including public opinion, economics, and health. And for us in the education space, there have been some very general guidelines that have been embedded. And that process, as we talked about last week, again, goes to the Department of Health and that's state health. And then it goes to this committee that the governor has, and also to a legislative commission that was outlined at the end of this. I think it was either the end of the session or probably in a special session. So there's this sifting process that then comes into the Utah Leads document, and the governor and his committee then make an executive order. He specifically makes an executive order, and this becomes an official document. So we've been a little bit lost of where we fit into that space and how we can be more specific with our schools to give them the direction that they are seeking. Yesterday, I felt like we had a very productive meeting, and so I'm going to turn some time over to Tiffany Stanley, and we also have a guest from the Levitt Group, Patricia Doxey, who will go through and talk a little bit more about the way we perceive to go forward, and then we would ask for your support through a motion at the end of this. So I'll turn it over to Tiffany Stanley.
Thank you, Superintendent Dixon. So I'm just going to quickly walk through this document that you have in your backup that outlines potential or proposed process and timeline for moving forward as expeditiously as possible. And then Patricia Doxey from the Levitt Partners will just provide a quick overview of a principles-based framework that I think is really helpful in thinking about how we establish, these guardrails, these minimum requirements through a, lens of how the virus behaves, and gives a really good sense of the complexity in schools and the various situational characteristics that various school environments have. So So referring to, oh, it's up there. All right. So referring to this document, one of the key pieces that we've been navigating through is to clarify roles. A couple of board meetings ago, we walked through that from a legal policy perspective. Who has the legal authority in various domains when it comes to pandemic emergency response. But through these conversations, we've fleshed that out quite a bit more to understand how it works in reality and on the ground. And in some instances, it's not exactly as it may appear on paper, right? The way things play out. So the governor's office in this space, they're really viewing their role as making the final decisions on those color-coded guidelines that are in the Utah Leads publication, and that they are prioritizing individual autonomy for operationalization of those guidelines. As far as the State Department of Health, they evaluate industry input with public health expertise to make recommendations for changes to the state's color-coded guidelines. That's their role, and that was what Superintendent Dixon spoke to in terms of that committee that forwards recommendations on. Then you have local health departments. So they really view their role as one of consultation as opposed to more of an authoritative directive role. So that they make recommendations to the state for adjustments to the guidelines, that they consult with LEAs, and then a critical piece, when schools are in session, is following up with symptomatic or COVID-19 positive cases. And then as far as our role, we are still discussing this, but that we would be making recommendations to the state health department as well on adjustments to those K-12 schools color-coded guidelines. And that we would also provide guidance and recommendations to LEAs on operationalizing those requirements. And there may even be conversations of us, establishing our own requirements separate from the state health department and the color-coded requirements and guidelines. And that's really up for all of you to continue to discuss and unpack. But what I think is critical here is that in terms of what is required by executive order currently, that those guidelines they go through this process of recommendations to this committee that then are forwarded on and then authorized through executive order. And then you have LEAs that are creating and implementing plans to operationalize the requirements down to individual schools who are implementing plans. So leading into this proposed process and timeline, the proposal is that we work with a cross-functional group to propose amendments to the existing phased guidelines. Some of what this is driven by is that those phased guidelines, they leave significant room for interpretation. And initially it was anticipated that local health departments would play a significant role in providing direction to LEAs on interpreting and applying those guidelines. But through these conversations, there's general agreement that local health departments should be in a consultative role as opposed to an authoritative role. And that kind of necessitates more clarity in those state level guidelines. So the proposed process would be that you all consider this process and timeline today. And then from there, that very quickly, next Tuesday, Wednesday, broad cross-functional group, including state and local health, USBE, LEAs, and others, meet to really hash this out in terms of clarifying those state level K-12 guidelines. And then a board meeting next Thursday to adopt what's proposed by that group or consider what's proposed by that group.
Tiffany, could you, either you or Jeff, whoever is driving, scroll down a little bit so everybody can see the timeline? Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Then that initial committee that reviews recommendations from various groups on changes to the phase guidelines would meet to review what the board has recommended. And then leading into those becoming formally adopted by the governor through the executive order process and a public announcement. And concurrently, if possible, that we would publish our document that would provide clarity on roles and decision-making process and authority. It would include these minimum requirements. It would include a framework that is principles-based to guide planning, and also a planning template to assist with those efforts locally, right, on operationalizing those high-level requirements given context. And then also forms and checklists for any procedures that are required. And then quickly after that, providing planning webinars for LEA teams. And you'll kind of get a preview of really high level what that sort of looks like in terms of this framework that Levitt Partners has developed. And then leading into LEAs publishing their plans and communicating with their parents, families, communities, students. So that is just that's the proposal in terms of the process and timeline. And with that, I will turn it over to Patricia Doxey from the Levitt Partners to just walk you through this principles-based approach.
Thank you, Tiffany. And if you could go to the PowerPoint that we have. What he's displaying is a white paper that has it in text format if that's easier for people to read through. There's a presentation, and if you can't pull that up, that's fine. I can just talk through the principles. So here we go. Is there a way to make that smaller so people can see the screen? Perfect. So this is a preview and understanding that schools, school board members, and LEAs are being asked to face a big problem, and it can become overwhelming. So Levitt Partners is a consulting company started by former Governor Levitt, and after he was HHS secretary, he wanted to continue to contribute to improve the system. So we have been advising clients, including the Utah system of higher education, on how to break down problems into its component parts. So we're just talking through a portion of this today. It's meant to be a problem-solving resource to mitigate risk. Of course, you can't take away risk completely, but it's about knowing the different aspects that you're weighing and being able to make an informed decision. So if we could go down, there's just a couple slides. There's some information for unique considerations for K through 12. Many of you have been probably following COVID-19 and its relation to children and young adults, but I wanted to highlight some of the principles. It does affect children less frequently than adults and tends to be less severe. And there are some specific symptoms that are more likely to present in children rather than adults. And most of the pediatric cases occur in children 15 to 17. And like adults, children with underlying conditions are more likely to suffer severe disease. And then there's been recent literature about asymptomatic spread, so people who don't have symptoms, and how much they spread because of this isn't well known in children, how often children who are not experiencing symptoms spread disease. It could be a lot and it could be a little. So those are some overview material. And if we could go down and look at statistics specifically related to children, both nationally through a CDC study and then specifically in Utah. So in a study February 12th through April 2nd, they found that 2% of cases presented in children. So that's just over 2,000 people. And 77% of children hospitalized with COVID-19 had an underlying condition that put them at increased risk. If we look at data in Utah, 6% of cases, so just under 700, occurred in children ages 1 to 14, and then individuals, 18% of individuals 15 to 24. So just looking at the different demographic, although it does impact children and young adults differently, we do see that there is a significant number of cases. So if we could move on. Thank you. And many of you have probably heard of a related disease. There isn't a lot that is known, but the CDC has issued a health alert, and they are tracking this symptom. Currently, there's 102 cases identified in New York State, and this is often an onset of symptoms a couple months down the road, but these are very different from the normal COVID-19 symptoms. And so it's something that they're also tracking and trying to understand the relationship between COVID-19 and this other disease that is presenting in children. So thank you. Let's move on. As Tiffany mentioned, we have been helping people understand how to direct their actions rooted in an understanding of the virus. So as we're looking to make decisions on the trade-offs and mitigating and not eliminating risk, as I said, it's about layering these mitigation strategies in promoting healthy behaviors and maintaining healthy operations, healthy environments, and then preparing for when someone gets sick. So in order to understand this, let's move to the next slide and just understand some principles. I won't go into detail here, but I wanted to show the next few slides just as a principle of how we can root our decision-making in an understanding of the virus. So first we need to think about how the virus moves and these key principles. So we break this down into two correlated areas. So we need to understand what the virus is doing and how the virus is doing it. It's reproducing. And we're learning more about the incubation period and how long people are contagious, both as they're presenting symptoms and after, and how they are, and it's also infecting. And we know that that infection rate can go up and down based off of social behavior. And as we are starting to venture out more into the public and in larger groups, that infection rate will largely go up just because of the probability and how the virus works. So we also need to understand how the virus is doing that. So through close contact with people. So it spreads through close contact, so roughly 3 to 6 feet is considered where normal respiratory output, so just breathing and talking normally, that puts people at increased risk. So those respiratory droplets, so that refers to droplets from the nose and mouth. You see here breathing, coughing, sneezing. It can also include laughing and singing. So any time where you are expelling potential respiratory droplets from your mouth. And then fomite contact, and that is a fancy word through touching surfaces or objects, and then touching the eyes, nose, or mouth. That could also include shaking somebody's hand or whatnot. So if we move down, we want to use these principles to figure out, okay, based off of what the virus is doing and how the virus is doing it, how can we mitigate risk? So isolating symptoms, isolating and quarantining individuals, and also monitoring symptoms through contact tracing. And this, of course, applies to schools when you have children or students who present symptoms at school. They need a separate area to be. Some of those can go home, but some of those students can't go home. And so it's figuring out how to isolate symptoms as much as possible. And then minimizing outbreak probability. And this is why we were asked to stay home. We were reducing the amount of people that we were interacting with. And like I mentioned, and in the fall, we will be going into larger groups. And so we need to think about, yes, we're venturing out into larger groups, larger classrooms, but how can we minimize group size where reasonable, and how can we reduce the amount of people that individuals and students and staff are interacting with on a day-to-day basis. And then these other principles that you all are familiar with, but physical distancing and how to maximize that distance, respiratory hygiene, including covering mouth, face masks, we've seen barriers, cloth coverings, and then exceptional physical hygiene through hand washing and also cleaning services. Now, these aren't revolutionary concepts, but as you move down to the next slide, these are principles that we want to root our decision making in. The virus does not care how difficult it is to implement. And like I said, we will not be able to mitigate risk completely, but it's about pulling the levers that we can in different situations to make our students and staff as safe as possible. So if we can move down, and I will be wrapping up in a few minutes. So go to the next slide. We encourage, when you're trying to make a decision, to break down situations into these different characteristics. So when you're trying to think of how risky a situation is, you want to think through, okay, what are the characteristics of this situation, and root it in what you know about the disease. So movement. So movement refers to if people are moving in an undirected or a directed way. And thinking through if you can control the amount of people and where they move in a space. Think of a library versus a classroom. In a library, students are going to be wandering around, touching lots of things. In a classroom, they can have an assigned seat. You can direct where they stand. Duration refers to 15 minutes. So 15 minutes isn't a magical number, but what it does is under 15 minutes, there's a lower risk of spread, and anything more than 15 minutes is an increased risk of spread. Proximity, that refers to that 6-foot distance. Anything above that, you're increased, or anything below that, you're increasing your risk of spread. Group size, similarly, the larger the group size, the more risk you're introducing into the situation. Respiratory output, you want to think through, how are people interacting in the space? Is this a classroom? Is this a math classroom? Or is this a choir class where people will be singing and increasing the respiratory output? And touch, you're thinking high touch or low touch. Are people touching lots of things? Are they touching each other? Or is there predictable minimal output or minimal touch? And then congestion points. So, you know, you think of something like a classroom, you could sit students a certain amount of distance away, but you also want to think about that congestion point at the door where students will be funneling in through a congestion point. So what this is meant to demonstrate is this is a big problem and it can feel overwhelming. But as soon as you start to break spaces and characteristics into these different characteristics, you can start to problem solve and apply strategies to reduce the risk of spread. And there are a couple examples. Tiffany, I don't know if you want to move on or if you want me to go through those examples now or at a later date.
Tiffany, what do you want to do?
Oh, I would defer to you. I would defer to you, Chair Huntsman. I think I'm not sure how much time we have left on the agenda, and I know there's lots of questions from board members, so I want to make sure that we have time to address those and move forward.
Let's see are we at a point, Tiffany, now where you can take questions from board members?
Yeah.
Let's go to the question piece.
Okay.
Well, board members, if you have questions, if you'd raise your hand. Board member Lear.
I have a question. Thank you. I have a question about some of the data that you provided, Ms. Doxey, a few minutes ago to the board in these slides. You talked about how many children are infected compared to adults. But one thing that one piece of information that I think is really relevant to schools is there were no data that I saw on your chart about, and maybe you don't have it, maybe it hasn't been collected, I don't know. But one of my concerns and our concerns is how many adults could be infected by means of children. If there are sick children, asymptomatic children, how would they affect the adults that are working with those children in schools? Do you have any?
So you're asking for, is there any data? And then you have a question, how would that work? So
I want to know if they have any data.
Okay.
A major concern. We know that we've been told over and over that children are not particularly vulnerable. But I have also heard frequently that adults are frequently vulnerable through children. So I want to know if there's any data on that.
Patricia, can you answer that?
Yes, I can.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, the data for the asymptomatic spread of children to adults is not known. It is assumed that there is spread through asymptomatic and symptomatic children to adults. Because it's an unknown, the public health community likes to take a more conservative approach, but there isn't data specifically on asymptomatic spread from adults to children. However, I will note, while there is decreased risk for children, you still saw in Utah that there still is significant disease amongst children. So 6% of ages 1 through 24, and then 18% in individuals 15 through 24. So yes.
Thank you. Quick follow-up, Chair.
You bet.
Are those data you can gather? Because I'm receiving several emails every day, and I was going to say zero, but maybe one emailer has acknowledged that children may not be as much at risk, though I acknowledge your data about children, but I would like to see that data that shows, so that we could show parents that children may be putting adults at risk, even though it doesn't seem to attack or harm children as much. I'm wondering if those are data you could gather, since you folks tend to be the presenters.
I will look to see if this is information that people are that are gathering, or if there's informal literature on the subject. But often these data points come to us through scientific studies, and there are no reliable scientific studies at this moment. But I will see if there are resources that we can access.
Patricia, this is Mark Huntsman. A question, and then Board Member Lear kind of brought it up on your statistics related to children. It's kind of like an apple-orange comparison, but you have data on your particular chart that's got statistics related to children on it, and you have the US on the left, where it says children under the age of 18 nationally, it's 2%. But your chart on the right, when you do a comparison to the state of Utah, someone chose to take that up to age 24. Was there a reason for that, and we didn't keep it at under the age of 18?
This is how the information is tracked on the state's coronavirus website. The information on the left was through a study. So I don't believe the CDC has given us the data. Sometimes they do give us the underlying data, and we can make a comparison. I will see if we can get the underlying data and make a comparison, but that is why they are broken down with those ages.
Because it would be, I think, nice for our board to be informed, and also the public and the LEAs to know what those numbers are. We do have some older children that get up over the age of 20 in our system, but the vast majority of them are definitely not.
I will ask, I'm not positive who has access to the information that's underlying that dashboard. And that dashboard is publicly available. It's on coronavirus.utah.gov/case counts. But I will see if we can get more information
Because
about how those break down.
As we're moving forward and talking about all of our kiddos here, our students, we have them we have elementary and then secondary and different age groups. And I think data would be pretty important as we're trying to mitigate risk moving forward. Okay, questions from board members. I'm sorry, I'm a little slow. I better run this. My Vice Chair Cummings, is somebody, I'm not seeing.
Oh, yeah, Board Member Earl just raised her hand.
Okay, Board Member Earl.
Yeah, is there any way I've read some research this week and some information coming out from the World Health Organization around asymptomatic transfers. I'm just wondering, because of course we're learning new information as we have more data coming out. Is there, I guess, the health department would reviewing that and updating that regularly? Is that accurate?
Updating what?
Well, information as far as and I guess I'm just wondering, are we going to be taking a look at that as well, or the group taking a look at that? So I can't speak for the group here. Levitt Partners does monitor. We produced a brief on this specific conversation, which is around asymptomatic spread. For those of you who weren't aware of this conversation, the World Health Organization had a press conference where it was communicated that spread through asymptomatic people was insignificant. They quickly had a follow-up conversation in the scientific community and mostly retracted that statement. And we have prepared a brief, and I'd be happy to share that with this group. And I know that the Utah Department of Health was aware of that. We also shared our research with them. Thank you. I was
follow up.
No, just clarification on that. I have another question, but I think once this is over, it's dealing with this with our $2 million, but I will address that after we're over with this particular presentation.
Okay. Any other questions from board members? Vice Chair Brittany Cummings, your hand's up.
Is a motion appropriate?
A motion would be appropriate.
Okay. I move that the board approve the proposed process and timeline for clarifying and establishing minimum requirements for K-12 schools to operate under the Utah Leads Together phased guidelines.
This is Board Member Newell. I'll second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. And the motion before the board is that the board approve the proposed process and timeline for clarifying and establishing minimum requirements for K-12 schools to operate under the Utah Leads Together phased guidelines. Discussion to the motion.
Hanson raising his hand.
Hey, Board Member Hanson.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to make a motion to amend the current motion to accept the guidelines with the exception of the Utah State Board of Education rules, which appear on the first page, adding the wording, the sentence says K-12 schools color-coded guidelines provide minimum requirements and guidance and recommendations to LEA, provide minimum health and safety requirements and guidance and recommendations to LEAs on operationalizing requirements. That's the amended motion, and if I can speak to that when you're ready.
Okay, 1 second. Is there a second to that proposed amendment?
Jenny Gravitt, second.
Okay,
Carol, sorry.
okay. You want to speak to your proposed amendment? Board Member Hanson.
Thank you. I think it's important. If we look at the process and timeline on page 2, we say that USBE is going to publish guidance, and we include down below minimum requirements. I just think it's important to be spelled out in the main body of the document, because I think that I don't believe we can wait for the state health department at all times. They need to approve the minimum standards. I don't know that we'll always be publish it in a new edition of the phase, and there will be time.
Okay. We have a proposed amendment to the motion. Discussion to the proposed amendment. Board Member Davis.
Thank you, Chair. Just a question. I think that I've been responding to people's emails and things, and people are going to start calling me Sybil. I mean, it feels like it's gone back and forth so much. I'm wondering, can we get a clarification on the final word on the requirements? Do requirements come only from the executive order that comes from the governor's office? And so we are, in this amendment, publishing those requirements and then adding guidance as to how to meet those requirements and suggestions and things like that? Or do the executive order requirements stand, and then we as a board add additional binding legal requirements for LEAs? Could somebody clarify that for me?
Superintendent, can you weigh in on
I think
that?
Tiffany's ready to respond. I heard her speak.
Okay, Tiffany.
So in terms of the timeline and the language that is referenced there under USB publishing guidance that includes references to the minimum requirements, the intent there was that that would be the minimum requirements that had been adopted through executive order. That being said, so the process sort of needs to play out. I think that the governor's office has indicated that they are interested in having these requirements be at a level to which it balances providing clarity on what LEAs and schools are expected to do at a minimum level to maintain health and safety in various school environments, but to not get super into the weeds on the how, and to still balance the need for flexibility and context, and really to allow for locals to take the principles in the framework that we sort of outlined and that we intend to provide training on, and make decisions about mitigating risk within their communities. So if this process plays out and those minimum requirements are at a level to which the board and LEAs still feel the need for more clarity and consistency across the state, and more standardization than what comes out of that process, then I could envision a scenario in which the Utah State Board of Education adopts its own. One of the challenges in that space is that if it is more restrictive than what has been provided through the governor's office, we would have to think through how that might play out in terms of the politics of that and potentially getting overturned, or what that could look like. But I think that process that we need to go through to come to agreement on what that minimum level is and what does need to be standardized across the state, and the kind of the granularity needs to play out to know where you go from there. So that's how, yeah.
Hey, did you have a follow-up, Board Member Davis?
No, thank you.
Hey, I have a question really quick, and I'm trying to make my computer work, and I'm failing at it. I'm trying to come back and bring everything into the right context. Maybe Superintendent, I can put you on the spot here. This proposed amendment does more or less of what was already proposed. I can't make that determination right now in going back on my split screen. This motion does, this proposed amendment to the motion.
Yeah, that's a great question. I was going to ask Jeff if we could see the original motion and the amendment together on the screen so that everybody's clear.
Because I can't, I'm failing to.
I can't see both the motion and the amendment.
The continuing enrollment measurement. And Chair Huntsman?
Yes, Vice Chair Cummings.
Oh, this is Tiffany.
Oh, Tiffany, sorry.
So the way that I'm interpreting the amendment as Jeff is pulling it up is that this would set forth that it is the plan or the intent of the State Board of Education as of this date to issue requirements on top of the requirements that would go through the executive order process. That's the way I'm interpreting it, but
that's how I'm seeing it too. These would be the State Board of Education will add additional requirements. That's how I'm seeing this.
And my apologies, I now see the blue wasn't showing up, so the blue is the amendment. Thank you. I concur. It just clarifies adding in the minimum requirements.
So basically it's adding, provide minimum requirement.
I would defer to Board Member Hanson, but I believe that's your intent, correct, Board Member Hanson?
Who? Board Member Hanson? Is that, Board Member Hanson, is that your intent that to this language we're adding that blue minimum, provide minimum requirements? Or Member Hanson, hopefully we didn't lose him.
He might be out of range. I know he's on the road, sir.
Okay. Well, who seconded it was Board Member Rabbit, I believe. Was that your intent on your second?
Yes, and then I also have a question when it's okay.
Well, yeah, feel free to speak to the, we've got this amendment on the table.
So in
thinking
about what Tiffany just said, I guess my issue is there's no place it says requirements until in the unamended version until the local education agency. So if we are in the amendment adding requirements to the requirements, where in the parts before does it say requirements? I guess that's where I struggle with. I want it to say the word requirements somewhere. And even at the governor's office, the State Department of Health, the local health departments, nowhere does it say anybody is saying requirements. So I want it to say requirements somewhere.
So Tiffany, can you answer that question about where else it might have the word requirements?
Yes. So one of the wonky parts about how what they've called those, phased guidelines, which is just that they've called it guidance and phased guidelines. However, it's all incorporated by executive order, so they are binding and then therefore requirements. So under governor's office, where it says makes final decisions on color-coded guidelines, that's just acknowledging that that's what they've called them. However, that wherever it says guidelines in this table, it could say requirements.
And can be requirements coming from the governor's office. the State Department of Health can say guidelines, but they also have the power to say requirements. Correct? The
Yes.
local health department can say guidelines and can also say requirements. Correct?
Yes, they do have that legal authority.
Because of their legal authority. And the question is, do we want to go to that space? I see this in the proposed amendment that the Utah State Board of Education is also in the guideline business. And with this amendment will be in the requirement, or could go to the requirement space. Correct? I mean, that's how I see that. And I believe that was the intent of the amendment. Hey, Vice Chair Brittany Cummings, your hand's up. Talking about the proposed amendment.
Correct. And so I have a question about the proposed amendment because the original motion, which isn't showing up on the screen that Jeff has, stated that the board approved the proposed process and timeline clarifying and establishing minimum requirements for K-12 schools to operate under the Utah Leads Together phased guidelines. And then the amendment goes to a document and tries to change
We're losing you, Brittany.
So the amendment is trying to change language in a document that isn't referenced in the original motion.
That is correct.
And so I'm just wondering if the is appropriate in the way it's stated, but I also have a just question about it conceptually. But anyways, I'm just wondering about the appropriateness of the amendment.
But it's almost like it's amending the proposed process, because isn't this included in the proposed process?
So the particular part that he's referencing is actually role clarity. And so I don't know, I mean, I guess if we want to, about the roles that have been defined, and so are we taking upon ourselves a role that wasn't defined by this group to, and it already talks about operationalizing the requirements that will be established by the governor's office. And so I'm just questioning this, like technically as to what role we have, as well as just is this motion, does it match the original?
And that's where I'm trying to figure out also, is the proposed motion adding to or is the amendment adding to or taken away from the proposed motion? And what's being done here is it's adding to words that are in the proposed. Isn't this part of the proposed process that hasn't been played out? Is that how I'm seeing it? I mean, is that?
Okay, so I guess then can I ask a follow-up question then, if that's the assumption that we're gonna go with, is then if this role clarity was defined by the group that got together, and we take upon ourselves additional requirements inside that role clarity that was decided, I just have a concern about that, similar to the discussion that we had last month, that the requirements be established by the governor's office, and that we provide guidelines and recommendations to operationalize those requirements. And so I would speak then against the amendment and move forward with the requirements that we will work on with others as we move forward.
Which all comes back to us supposedly next week. Superintendent, can you weigh in on Brittany's question, because it was kind of breaking up and I didn't get all of it, but I got part of it.
Well, if I understood it correct, you were breaking up a lot for me as well, so I missed a lot of it. But I think either way with the motion, as we engage in the work next week, part of that is to get clear on behalf of the LEAs what is required. We've used words like guardrails and required, and that's what they're asking for. So filling in some of those blanks around those issues. And then really the bulk of the intention of the motion is to get your approval to engage in the process so that it's clearly outlined instead of this nebulous process that we've had in the past. Engaging in these work groups that are outlined in the process, I think, will then enable us to flesh out that language. So either way, I think the motion can work, but if it creates confusion about the roles, that's something you all need to decide. We can do the work regardless. Just whatever your preference is, if I heard your question correctly.
Did you have a follow-up, Vice Chair Cummings? And then I'll go to, if not, I'll go to these other questions.
Sorry, I just modified my speaker. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. So just to clarify, thank you for restating. So it's just clarifying that I would like to speak against the amendment because I think the original motion is to work on those requirements together, and then next step, provide the guidance, the operational guidance. And so I want to make sure that we're not going to work on requirements and then in the process of guidance, we actually add additional requirements. So I'm going to speak against the amendment. Thank you for your answer.
All right. Board Member Mark Marsh.
Jeez.
Thank you, Chair Huntsman. I also would speak against the amendment to the main motion. The main motion clearly states that the governor is instating an executive order, which is the requirement that we will be doing. And he is doing that in consultation with the health departments, local, county, and state, to make sure that he makes the right decision that affects all of us. But for us to step into the lane of starting to make requirements again goes back to that discussion that that's not our place. The governor and the health departments make the requirements. The local LEAs have to make it happen in their district by enacting it in the best way that fits their district or their school or their charter school, however that might be. And it's our job to assist them in acquiring things that they might need, or giving them ideas, or helping them with the guidance to be able to match that requirement. So I would ask that we not vote for the amendment, but to stay with the main motion.
Okay. Thank you. Board Member Earl.
Can we put the original motion back up? And
Hey, well, that's going up. I'll read the original motion.
Okay.
The original motion was that the board approved the proposed process and timeline for clarifying and establishing minimum requirements for K-12 schools to operate under the Utah Leads Together phased guidelines, period.
Okay, and so the amendment, where is that located to? I just don't have it in.
The amendment was
to this document. Okay.
Was to make recommendations to the this is on USB's role in this, is make recommendations to the state health department on adjustments to K-12 school color-coded guidelines, provide minimum requirements, guidance, and recommendations to LEAs on operationalizing requirements. Sorry, that was a mouthful for me. So it's adding.
Okay, I'm seeing the confusion because the one would be sending it through the health department. The other would be a directive coming from us that could be in addition to. Is that? Yeah. Okay. I just try to see both in front of me. Thank you.
Okay. So, but right now we're speaking to the amendment. Board Member Lear.
Thank you. Those of us who were on the call yesterday, Dr. Dixon, Jenny Gravitt, myself, Scott Hansen, heard definitely from those involved, including Richard Saunders from the governor's office, the USBE should take the lead. that to state differently, I think what Vice Chair Cummings was trying to say was that they're thinking yesterday, I heard that from Richard Saunders. I heard it from Gary Edwards. I heard it from one other individual that I'm forgetting now, but they were clearly in that meeting yesterday, governor's people, health department people saying, yes, USBE, please take the lead. And as I heard what they said yesterday, it was that the board's directives would inform the executive order, would inform the requirements that were built into the directive, into the executive order. And then those, the executive order would essentially, I don't care that the board gets credit for them or not, may not, but the executive order would be, requirements would be created from what the board offered. They acknowledged freely that they were health department experts, but they were not school experts and didn't want to be. They've been working closely with schools, but they didn't want to do anything other than respond to the, shouldn't say do anything. What they wanted to do, as I heard them yesterday, was respond to schools' questions and requests for clarification. But they were very appreciative that the state board was saying, we would like to inform the governor's directives. So I would vote in favor. I would, and that's what I think Scott Hansen, who was also on the call yesterday, was trying to accomplish. And I would like to be responsive to those people on that call yesterday, as well as what we're hearing from LEAs. So I would speak in favor of that motion.
Okay. Board Member Davis.
Thank you. I have an amendment to the amendment. I move that we change the amendment to read, make recommendations to the state health department on adjustments to K-12 schools, color-coded guidelines, comma, communicate minimum requirements, comma, and provide guidance and recommendations to LEAs on operationalizing requirements. And I'd like to speak to the motion.
I would second that, Marsh.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. You want to speak to the proposed amendment?
I do, thank you.
Okay.
I'll go back to what I've been saying from the very beginning of this discussion, is that our priority needs to be clarity of communication. And in the end, I don't know that it even matters where the requirements are coming from, but LEAs need to know, what do they have to do and what are their choices? And even in this discussion, I've heard the only requirements so far in our blue chart that was on the screen for quite a while come from an executive order from the governor's office. And yet in our chart, it doesn't say requirement anywhere or executive order anywhere in that chart. And I also heard the health department is in a consultation mode, not a requirement mode, unless I misunderstood that. And then later in the conversation, I heard if the local health department is working with the school, then the school has to implement those requirements. So whichever of those entities have actual legal authority to give requirements, that should be written in and communicated in the chart that we've provided. And then however it is that we finally, in the end, figure out or flesh out who is actually providing what is absolutely required, we communicate that to the LEAs, and then we provide guidance and recommendations. So this language isn't quite written as, Jeff, I don't know if you're listening, but my recommendation and my motion is to write communicate minimum requirements, comma, and provide guidance and recommendations to LEAs on operationalizing requirements.
Discussion.
If we need to add a requirement to the executive order, I'm sure that we can vote on that at that time. But I'm not getting the sense from anyone that they want to pile on a bunch of requirements on top of the executive order right now. So I move that we amend this way. We communicate clearly and we provide clarity, and hopefully the waters will become a little less muddy.
And I usually don't weigh in very much on these things, but the amendment to the amendment, in my mind, puts us right back to the original motion. As I'm looking at the context of the work that will take place in the original motion. If I'm wrong, Superintendent, can you somebody tell me I'm wrong? But
yeah,
amendment to the amendment puts us right back into that space. So I'm just trying to help guide the discussion.
Yeah, I think this is where we've gone awry a little bit. So the original motion by Brittany, this is where I admit that I got confused a bit. The original motion by Vice Chair Cummings was really about the process. So it was the focus of here's how to get to this place to describe what several board members have just described. And that was the motion is to look at that abbreviated timeline and the process and the way forward. The roles in that blue chart was just a point of reference to talk about how the various roles have been playing out and how we see these various roles. So Board Member Davis is correct that there was conversation about they have a role to play in the overall Utah leads and the way forward, but they also have authority as local and state health authorities at any given time with their schools. So what we're trying to accomplish is to have you approve the timeline and the process and just reference the role so everybody can see how the role of the Board of Education factors into all of this. So I have to state that because it is the process that we're trying to move forward on. And if you feel like establishing some verbiage in that role is okay, but we're not asking you to adopt that role document. That's just sort of a guidance piece for this conversation. I just want to be clear about that.
Okay, well, I think you just supported my thought on this, that we're getting the cart before the horse just a little bit, but then it's coming back to this amendment to the amendment puts us almost right back to the same space of the original motion. But, okay, board member questions or comments to the proposed amendment to the amendment. Board member Mark Marsh.
I think you're right, Chair Huntsman. Cindy's got us almost back to the beginning point. I think we just need to kind of stay with the main motion that we have, and then from there we can go on out. I still feel we're just the information and communication part of this process.
Okay. Board member Jenny Gravitt.
Thank you. I wasn't sure whether this is the appropriate time to speak after Superintendent Dixon's comment, because we are speaking about process, but since we do have this amendment to the amendment on the table, I just wanted to add that there are enough of us who didn't get this message that I think Cindy Davis's amendment to the amendment is important, because for me as a teacher, whoever does it, I really, really want somebody to take away the burden from me as a teacher to make all of these other decisions. I want to focus on my teaching. I want to make the decisions to meaningfully teach. And the teachers I know, we are begging for some minimum requirements, and I want it clearly stated. There's too much hedging, I feel, and I'm not, saying that to anyone specifically, but I just feel like we need to be very clear, and I want it to say somewhere, not the word guidelines, not the word, I want it to say minimum requirements, because I don't want to take the political fall as a teacher. I'll take it other places, but as a teacher, I want to teach, and I want somebody to tell me what I need to do, and then I can work within those parameters. So I support the amendment to the amendment if we are talking about it. And I think that's clarity. So thank you, Cindy Davis.
Okay. Cindy, your hand's still up.
Yeah, thank you. I just went back. I'm not sure if the motion that was read is the same one that's in our agenda item. It's not on our shared screen, so I went to another computer. And it does talk about establishing minimum requirements, but back in the original recommended action, if that's the motion we're talking about, original, what is the proposed process that we are approving? It seems like the amendment explains the proposed process. So maybe someone could just show us where it's written in black and white. Is the proposed process that we provide guidance to LEAs as to how they implement executive order requirements? Or is the proposed process in the original motion that we are creating minimum requirements that we're going to add on top of the executive orders? I just think we need some clarity as to know how to vote on these.
Chair Huntsman, could I weigh in and maybe provide clarity on?
Yes.
So going back to the motion, the original motion that I think was in the backup, if we could, it is probably out of place to try to give you language to amend the motion, but hearing what everybody's saying, it's clear from the field and from board members who have weighed in on the requirement piece. So I'm wondering if we could go back to the motion that was in the, I don't know if it was the original because it's not on the screen, but amending the process to include the board adding additional requirements. Otherwise, it feels like we almost need two motions, one that's really about the timeline and the process, and then one that is to clarify our roles. So there could either be maybe two different motions or one motion on the process that actually includes something about creating additional requirements. Hope that makes sense.
Well, you're making sense, but words matter, as we've learned in the past. And so every word in every motion and every word in every amendment becomes super, super relevant. And I'm not going to hijack the, I think we've just got to stay with Robert's rules on where we're at on these proposed amendments. And if somebody wants to make another motion, whether something passes or fails, then we can certainly do that.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I just feel like we've blended something off of a screen about roles and a motion about the process. So however we can unpack that so that the board, that we have clear direction going into next week and the board has their voice heard about the requirements.
Okay, well, we have a proposed amendment before us. Any other discussion to the proposed amendment? I'm not seeing any hands, so we're going to vote on the proposed amendment to the amendment. And the proposed amendment to the amendment would read like this. Make recommendations to the state health department on adjustments to K-12 schools color-coded guidelines. The amendment would say communicate minimum requirements. That's part of the amendment. The amendment then would continue and provide guidance with another word added in the amendment to the amendment requirement and recommendations.
Sorry, I did not add the word requirements a second time.
What's that? You didn't say the requirements a second time?
I did not add that word a second time.
Thank you. Can you see what I see? Anybody? Okay. So basically it's putting communicate minimum requirements in between guidelines and provide, as I'm showing here. So I'll state what the amendment to the amendment would say, make recommendations to the state health department on adjustments to K-12 schools color-coded guidelines, comma, communicate minimum requirements, comma, provide guidance and recommendations to LEAs on operationalizing requirements.
The word "and" should be put in before the word "provide." So it reads, communicate minimum requirements and provide guidance. Thank you.
Can you see what I see, Board Member Davis? You're seeing it on your screen.
Thank you, yes.
Okay. I'll restate it again. The amendment to the amendment would read, make recommendations to the state health department on adjustments to K-12 schools, color-coded guidelines, comma, communicate minimum requirements, comma, and provide guidance and recommendations to LEAs on operationalizing requirements, period. Okay, we're voting on the amendment to the amendment. Board Member Scott Hansen, I know you're on the phone. I hope that you're back on. Are you a yay or nay?
I'm back on. I'll be a yay on this one.
Okay. It appears the voting is complete and is unanimous. The proposed amendment to the amendment passes. Now we have the amendment, the new amended amendment to the motion. Which reads, oop, I lost it. That on the USBE's role in the document to read, make recommendations to the state health department on adjustments to K-12 schools, color-coded guidelines, comma, communicate minimum requirements, comma, and provide guidance and recommendations to LEAs on operationalizing requirements, period. I'm not seeing any discussion to the motion, so let's, to the amended amendment, so let's vote. Board Member Scott Hansen, you're on the phone. Are you a yay or nay?
Vote aye. Chairman, aye.
Thank you. I have your vote. Vice Chair, yep, there's, okay.
This is Lorraine. Is Board Member Belknap still on the phone?
She is not. She had to step off.
She was not on the last vote. Vice Chair Cummings, tell me if I'm wrong, but it appears the voting is unanimous and complete.
Yes.
And the board member's not voting. Board Member Scott Nielsen isn't with us, and neither is Board Member Belknap. Okay, now the motion before the board is that the board approve the proposed process and timeline for clarifying and establishing minimum requirements for K-12 schools to operate under the Utah Leads Together phased guidelines as amended. I'm not seeing any hands up, so let's vote. Again, the motion before the board is that the board approve the proposed process and timeline for clarifying and establishing minimum requirements for K-12 schools to operate under the Utah Leads Together phased guidelines. Board members, at this time, please vote. Board Member Scott Hansen. Are you still with us? He's in some bad cell coverage. So it appears the voting is unanimous. Board Member Scott Hansen isn't with us on the cell anymore, and Board Member Belknap and Board Member Nielsen aren't with, but everyone else voted and it was unanimous. So the motion passes. Okay, Superintendent and staff, you've got your marching orders in this motion. Any questions, Superintendent?
No, thank you so much for the conversation, and especially appreciate those board members who will be joining in this work. It's just hunkering down and getting it done and getting it out to the field and communicating clearly. So thank you to everyone, but especially to those that are leaning in.
Okay, thank you. Before I move off, I'm not sure if we have any other questions on this, but I believe Board Member Earl, your hand is up.
Yeah, I did have a question. And this was regarding our role with the $2 million. I received a number of questions over the weekend of the intent of that. And my understanding, you can correct me if I'm wrong, help me maybe with some clarification, that the intent behind that money that we set aside was not necessarily to supplant the efforts of our districts and take over the purchasing of all their needed supplies or that type of a thing, but it was to just to assist them in supporting their efforts. Could someone maybe provide some clarity in that? There seems to be some ambiguity among the people I've talked with.
Superintendent?
Yeah, this is Superintendent Dixon. You stated that well, Board Member Earl. It is to support their efforts. Some of our LEAs were having a hard time with the pipeline, and because we have a streamlined process through state purchasing where they have some state-approved pipelines for a number of items, then we're here to support and help them. We know that many have spent some of their ESSER funding on cleaning supplies, for example. That's something that we didn't include in the $2 million. So ours has been more about trying to get them items that they have struggled to get and do it on a statewide basis to help them, as well as free up some of their ESSER funds for unfinished learning in the summer and into the fall.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to make sure I understood that. Exactly what you said is how I understood it, not necessarily that we were going to take care of all their needs and, that requests and stuff, but we would support in those areas of need. So
Okay,
thank you.
correct. Thank you.
Okay, board members, I think, I'm not seeing any other hands, but there's a few checks still left and on your voting. Okay, thank you, Superintendent. Next, we will go to Deputy Superintendent Angie Stallings. We have quite a few items here. Are you ready to?
I am.
Present? Okay.
All right. Thank you, Chair Huntsman. Angie Stallings, Deputy Superintendent of Policy. And Jeff, if you could go to agenda item 5.1 and pull up the statutory changes due to budget changes document. In just a minute, I'm going to turn the time to Jill Curry, who helped do some research, and just for her to describe the process. But the next two agenda items we'll be presenting today are some background on work we've been doing as staff to determine or identify potential requests for statutory changes for the 2021 school year. Some of those are related to pending budget cuts that we're anticipating next week. And a couple are not necessarily related to budget cuts, but to support the LEAs based on information that we know. Also, we'll in 5.2, we'll be discussing some potential requests for waiver to board rule, and we'll talk about those in a minute. So first, I'd like it, Chair Huntsman, if it's okay with you, for Jill and I still don't see, Jeff, that you've got the document up. It's called Statutory changes due to budget changes. It's a spreadsheet. If you could please show that. And Jill will describe what research she did and how we came up with the 2 yeses that are on there. Jill, could you
Jill,
speak to that?
are you ready to come on?
Yes, yeah, I'm here. So Jill Curry, Program Analyst, Utah State Board of Education.
Welcome.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk to you about the process I used to identify statutory changes for 2020 general session legislation. Like Angie said, due to anticipated upcoming budget changes, this would be changes due to the elimination of most of the new funds appropriated to public education in the 2020 session. So specifically, this relates to bills passed with a corresponding appropriation. So the basic method that I used to put together this list was to revisit each education bill that had an appropriation tied to it. And I examined the language around bill requirements and the availability of the appropriation. So in the table that hopefully you can see on the screen, you can see that most of the bills contain language that would allow the statutory language to remain even with no appropriation. So examples of that language include within appropriations made by the legislature and subject to appropriations. 2 bills were identified as needing statutory changes due to not having this type of language. You can see those bills at the top of the table. So HB 114, which is that very first row, states the state board shall approve a benchmark assessment for use statewide by LEAs to assess the mathematics competency of students in kindergarten and grades 1 through 3. The next row below that, Senate Bill 73 states the state board shall approve a benchmark assessment for use statewide to assess reading competency in students in grades 1 through 6. And the state board shall contract with 1 or more educational technology providers. HB 58 is on the list as a maybe. This bill is funded through a general fund restricted account, which is not anticipated to be part of the budget cuts. However, if it is part of the budget cuts, then statutory changes would be needed for this bill as well. And with that, I'll take any questions or turn the time back over.
Let's see if there's any, I'm going to look see if there's any questions for you, Jill.
Okay.
Checking hands. And thank you for doing this work. You're turning over a lot of rocks and trying to get us prepared for next school year and take advantage of this session. Not seeing any hands, so thank you.
I do have a question. This is Board Member Earl, sorry.
Oh, now I do see a hand. There you go, Board Member Earl.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't know why I missed. Maybe there's a lag effect or something that hits on this. Board Member Earl.
There might be. I'm in Colorado in the mountains, so there very well could be. So the language that's there is the language that would need to be changed. It's not, the language that's there is not our recommendation. Is that accurate?
Yes, yeah, that's accurate. So the language is there, was pulled straight from statute.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure the highlighted, I understood why the highlighted was there. It wasn't a recommended change, it's what would need to be changed. Okay.
Yes. Yeah, that's correct.
Chair Huntsman, may I continue now?
Yes.
There's more questions. And to answer your question, Board Member Earl, in just a moment, there's a separate document. If you look on Civic Clerk, which I'm not going to ask Jeff to show just yet because I'm still providing the background. But if you want to go ahead and take a look ahead of time, you can see that we've got draft 2 of a draft motion related to request for statutory change. And that will be the motion we're looking for in just a moment. So Jeff, if you'd now show the other document, which is actually in backup under 5.2, but there is one change in here that is also a statutory change. And you'll see on the top of this document that staff recommends that the board consider requesting the legislature to amend section 53F-8-303. This section of code governs the capital levy that local school districts are able to levy, and right now that capital levy is limited to being used for capital expenses such as buildings. And during the 2010 recession, during the 2011 and 2012, so 2011-12 and 2012-13 school years, the legislature previously allowed school districts to use their capital, the revenue collected from their capital levy, for maintenance and operation purposes or for general fund purposes. And we've had a request, Deputy Superintendent Scott Jones and I, to join the legislature's Revenue and Taxation Interim Committee next Wednesday. And one of the questions that they'll be considering is whether or not the legislature should allow and change that section of code to allow districts to use their capital levy revenue for general fund purposes. So that's one of the recommendations we have for you, is to support that, and we could report to the Revenue and Taxation Interim Committee next week about your support or not for that. And then the last section of code that staff recommends we reach out to the legislature about, and I apologize, it's not on either of these two tables, but Jeff, if you'll now open up that draft 2, the draft motion related to requests for statutory changes. The last one on that list is a recommendation to waive the requirement in section 53G-9-802. It requires LEAs to enter into a contract with third-party providers to provide dropout prevention and recovery services under certain circumstances. Because we had a lot of students and it was a kind of a unique time period with COVID-19, we think that the measurements that we currently have in statute and board rule to trigger that requirement might artificially be higher than normal. And so we recommend that for this next school year, LEAs not be required to contract with a third-party provider for those services. And we've got staff that are familiar with each of these programs that are also available for questions, and I'm also happy to answer questions. But you can see the motion there on the screen, the staff recommended motion, if you have questions.
So, Angie, could you speak to the capital levy piece where we as a board have already talked about that in the past? In fact, it was part of our lines of defense in case of a recession and other things that we were trying to move forward in the last session.
Yes.
Do you remember that?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Thank you for refreshing my memory to remind the board that this last session, you'll remember HB 357, which was the bill that created the stabilization account and a new structure that's dependent on the passage of the constitutional amendment this fall. Part of that legislation would have provided this flexibility. Anytime we had a recession of sorts, the way it's described in the bill is of course more analytical, or it's not as intuitive to describe right now, and I can't remember the exact language. But essentially, if we had a recession, that it would allow the board to signal and tell school districts that for the year or years during that recession, that districts would be able to use their capital levy revenue for general fund purposes. So the legislature supported it, and it was contingent or will be contingent on the constitutional amendment passing this fall. But we would like to have it for the 2021 school year. If we wait, that may not be available until the school year after, if we wait for HB 357, because it's not in effect yet.
And can you speak to, I understand there's already a bill file opened.
Actually, I'm not sure about a bill file being open, but the revenue.
Snow was
okay. Open. I wasn't aware of that. So thanks, Chair.
All right. Yeah, it was brought to my attention today.
Great.
All right. Any questions? Okay, Board Member Janet Cannon.
Yes, Angie, as I understand it, the revenue generated by the capital levy is what school districts use to build buildings and, all of those kind of things. Can you tell me what type of things that they might transfer the use of that funding to that would come under the school district's general fund?
Yes. So the school district's general fund can fund anything. So probably the largest portion of what a school district's general fund funds right now would be salaries and benefits. It's supporting the salaries of the educators and employees who support schools.
Thank you.
So if I might take the liberty to weigh in, when I was on my local board, back when this was allowed, it was a huge lifesaver, and not all LEAs will access this, but it's money that legally can be put into the general fund for anything within that general fund, but mostly it is used to protect salaries and employees and programs, and it's up to the LEA and the local boards to make a determination whether they go into that. Of course, the whole intent is to build buildings, but in a time of crisis and stuff, they have that revenue they're sitting, and they can put some of that construction on pause to prop up education. And I would
Yes.
turn my mic on, but my video, but I'm not seeing it. I can't even see where I can mute myself now. That is odd. Okay, any other questions from board members? So the staff recommendation for the motion was that the board direct staff to work with legislators to make the recommended changes to statute. At this time, any board members want to make a motion? I'm looking for hands. Board Member Thorpe.
I'll make that motion. Do you want me to read it out?
Or you could say so moved.
So moved.
Okay. Is there a
Board Member
Second.
Who is the second?
Belknap.
Okay, thank you. Board Member Belknap's back with us. So the motion before the board is that the board direct staff to work with legislators to make the recommended changes to the statute. Discussion to that motion. I'm not seeing any, so let's vote. Board Member Belknap, are you by phone, I presume?
Yes. Yes, I vote yes. Thank you. Sure.
Okay, thank you. Board Member Hanson, are you back with us? Board Member Scott Hanson? He was in and out of cell coverage. Board Member Marsh, there we go. The voting is complete, and the motion passes unanimously with Board Member Scott Hanson not on the phone to vote, and Board Member Scott Nielsen not with us. Thank you. Angie, do you have anything to conclude?
Yes, so this is on the statutory changes. I just wanted to make one, just kind of give you a point of information based on some conversations I've had with legislators and legislative staff. If you, so we've got these 4 items here, as well as a couple of items from motions you've made in previous months related to requests for statutory changes. I clarified or asked a member of leadership as well as staff about when they anticipate undertaking or dealing with policy changes versus budget changes. And the feedback that I was given is they're trying to minimize as much as possible the number of policy changes or statutory changes that are needed. And they have identified, one staffer told me, hundreds of policy changes that are likely to be made or need to be made potentially based due to the budget cuts that might occur or budget adjustments that might occur next week. And so right now they're trying to limit those that actually trigger maybe revenue coming in or revenues, kind of more of the tax related triggers or restricted account triggers, not so much some of the changes that we just took action on today, although I could see potentially the capital levy one making it into a bill next week. But the others, there's a chance that they would not be made, the changes wouldn't be made until August, an August special session, which I've been told is fairly likely to happen. What they said they would likely do is make the budget adjustments and then reach out to legislators who were sponsors, especially of some of the 2020 legislation, and ask them what they think they'd like to do with some of the requirements, and then address all of those in August or even wait until the 2021 legislative session. So I wanted to give you that heads up because although you've made a motion now for us to work on these items, don't be surprised if only one or none of them make their way into a bill next week. They would likely come in August or later. So Chair, is it okay now if I move to 5.2, the board rule waivers?
Yeah.
Okay.
Am I muted?
Oh, yes, thank you. I'll move forward. So, and now,
It's
Hang on,
Carol.
there's a question. Board Member Lear?
Thank you. Sorry to be rude, but I seem to get overlooked. I had a question, Angie. You said there, according to the staff, there were hundreds of potential policy changes. Could you perhaps give me some examples of those? And then second, similar to that question, part of that question is, are any of the school fees changes going to be involved with that?
thank you for that question, because I realize now that I said that most of the hundreds of policy changes I'm mentioning are not education. So we're talking about any budget adjustments related to human services or, DWS. I mean, there's so many bills that passed during the 2020 session, and many had a lot of appropriations attached to those bills. So we, when you say hundreds, so some of these, if you go back, and I don't know, Jeff, if you can go back to the other document that Jill reviewed, you'll notice that we've listed pretty much every bill that passed during the 2020 session. The good news is that the majority of those bills that passed had a subject to legislative appropriations clause in it, making it so that we could keep those policies on the books until a time when they could be funded. So an example of that would be, well, the one that you see here, we've got HB 114. And Jeff, are you able to hear me? I know that Jeff has had some internet problems today, and so he may not be able to.
And don't worry about taking a lot of time. I 2 or 3 examples so that I had in my head what you thought of, they thought of as policy changes versus what I might think of as policy changes. That's what I was looking for.
Well, 2 of them are 2 that you can see that you just voted on, which is the requirement to have a mathematics assessment in the early grades. That did not have a subject to legislative appropriations, and we need the money to do that. I think there was like $300,000 appropriated for us to procure that assessment, and then the LEAs would use it, so they wouldn't have to buy the assessment. So that's an example of, due to a budget cut, if the money's not there. Same with the other elements of HB 114. We had in there money for professional learning. We had money going to higher ed institutions to pay for the pedagogical assessment costs. So that's an example there.
That's good enough. That helps. I'm always a little cautious about what someone thinks of as a policy adjustment and what I think of as a policy change. So I appreciate the examples. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I am not seeing any other
Okay, great.
hands up, and my controls kind of changed. So Vice Chair Brittany Cummings, if I'm missing something, weigh in. I've lost my video, but I still have audio. So, all right, so please continue, Angie.
Okay, so the next we're to item 5.2, which are requests for board rule waiver or flexibility. And you've got on your screen, you can see the document that Jill and I prepared with the support of staff. You can see there's, I think, about 46 items that the staff reviewed and provided input on. So what we did to start this document is we started with the list of requests for statutory changes and requests for board rule waiver that you had already approved for the 2019-20 school year, to see if, okay, here's some flexibility we provided for the 19-20 school year. Do we think we will need that same flexibility for the 2021 school year? So you can see that of the list, there's really only 3, and one you just took care of with the last motion for the statutory change. And we identified 2 programs that right now we anticipate needing some flexibility. So the first one is the Beverly Taylor Sorensen Arts Program, where that rule requires the board and staff to notify LEAs of how much money they'll be receiving under the Beverly Taylor Sorensen Arts Program by June 1st. Because of the pending budget changes, and the Beverly Taylor Sorensen Arts Program is in a unique situation where in the 2019 school year, they had some one-time money that was given. And so they're unsure about how that program might be impacted. So we're going to be, you'll see there's a motion in a moment to request a waiver from that rule to extend that deadline from June 1st to July 15th. Then the second item on there that has a yes next to it is related to the concurrent enrollment program. And in lieu of doing a waiver at this time, we are actually going to request an amendment, have a staff recommended amendment to this rule. It's going to be R277701 in your July meeting. That rule, the 713 and 701, were just recently reviewed by the Standards and Assessment Committee, and will be coming to the board in July. And so you'll see an amendment in July based on what we found out. I'll just give you a brief summary of the issue. There's a provision in there that states that the superintendent may not distribute concurrent enrollment funds to an LEA for reimbursement of a concurrent enrollment course for a course that's repeated by a student. We had a number of students this last spring, winter, that withdrew from their concurrent enrollment courses, so they didn't complete them, but they withdrew. And so we've got some of our higher ed institutions who are interpreting repeating a course differently than we would. And we've been interpreting it to mean repeating means the student completed the course, received a grade, and then is trying to repeat the course. So we're going to ask for a definition of repeated to be included in the board rule so that if a student withdraws from the course before finishing it, that the student would be able to take it again, or, they haven't completed it, so that this would not impact their ability to take a concurrent enrollment course in the future. The rest of them, you can see there's quite a few here. Many of them are maybe too early to know, and there's a number that are no later on in the list, and much of that has to do with changes, for example, to licensing provisions. And I think just the fact that now we have people who will be anticipating some of what we didn't anticipate in the spring, we're able to plan ahead. So that's kind of the list that we're working through. We'll continue to provide you updates. There's a motion that we have with respect to the Beverly Taylor Sorensen Act program. And then I'd also like to, after that, I do have a bit of a presentation or an update for you on our work related to the 180 and 990. And the last thing I wanted to let you know is we did ask Deputy Superintendent Scott Jones did give some BAs also some access and sought some feedback from them on that list. And their list, they also had everything as maybe too early to tell or no. So it looks like for now, this is all we've got, but we'll continue to work on it. So there's the draft motion that the staff is recommending you make. And then after that, again, I'd like to talk about the 180-day, 990-hour requirement.
Okay. So Deputy Superintendent Stallings, you will have that opportunity under like an informational piece to talk about the 180, 990. So
yes, thank
you
you.
have this under an actionable piece. So taking a motion or questions from board members, Board Member Cannon.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to make the following motion. Due to pending budget adjustments to the fiscal year 21 budget, the State Board of Education waives the requirement in subsection R277-490-4 that the board designate an LEA or a consortium for Beverly Taylor Sorensen Elementary Arts Learning Program funding no later than June 1st annually, and extends the deadline for staff to notify an LEA or consortium of their eligibility for program funds to no later than July 15, 2020.
Okay, we have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second from Board Member Thorpe.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Discussion to the motion. Board Member Earl.
I just had a question on the date, the July 15th. I'm assuming you've probably talked with people, just wondering if that is enough time based on the fact we're not sure on the funding for some of the, this particular program yet. Is that going to be enough time, or is this based on previous years funding?
Thank you, Chair. Could I answer that?
Yes, Deputy Superintendent Stallings.
So the special session, as you know, will be next week. It's June 18th and 19th. Assuming that they make all of the budget adjustments by next Friday, and even if they were to go into maybe the next week, early, I guess the 19th, 20th, so on, I'm sorry about the dates, but that our staff feels like they'll need a little bit of time to work with our financial ops staff to make sure we know exactly what funding we have available. And our staff plans to notify LEAs even sooner than July 15th. They'd like to get the information out to LEAs ASAP and are very anxious themselves to get them that data. We just wanted to get the expectation out there to the LEAs that it would be no later than July 15th, but we're hoping it could even be as soon as the week after the special session or earlier in July.
Okay, perfect. I just wanted to make sure we had an adequate time frame. Thank you.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other hands, so we're going to vote on this. The motion before the board is that due to pending budget adjustments to the fiscal year 21 budget, the State Board of Education waives the requirement in subsection R277-490-4 that the board designate an LEA or a consortium for Beverly Taylor Sorensen Elementary Arts Learning Program funding no later than June 1st annually, and extend the deadline for staff to notify an LEA or consortium of their eligibility for program funds to no later than July 15th, 2020. Okay, let's all, at this time, board members, if you please vote.
Board Member Belknap, yes.
Okay, thank you. Board Member Belknap's a yes. Board Member Scott.
Board Member Hanson, also yes.
Okay, thank you. And I don't believe we have Board Member Scott Nelson on. Okay, the voting is complete. And the voting is unanimous. So this motion passes. Thank you, board members. Deputy Superintendent Stallings, this is an informational piece that you're bringing forward, so there won't be any motion on this, but can you give us a little bit of an update? I'm not sure if you
Yes.
have a presentation on the.
I do. And Chair Huntsman, I think that Jeff would like to switch presenter roles over to me for this presentation.
Okay.
Jeff, would you like to do
This
that?
will be our last.
Yes, it'll be fast.
Item. So, Jeff and Holton, would you please switch that over?
Or Jerry?
Yes.
I believe Jeff might be out. He's been having some major internet problems. Okay, now I am the presenter. Thank you. I will go ahead and start. So board members, you may have received some questions, and could someone just verify that they are able to see the presentation?
I can see it on my screen. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. So this is just an update to let you know that there are questions about what will happen with the 180-day and the 990-hour requirements that we have in 419. And to give you an update on the work that staff's doing. As you all know, R277419 currently requires LEAs to provide no less than 990 instructional hours over a minimum of 180 school days each school year. And with COVID-19, we saw how that changed a bit as students moved from receiving their instruction in a classroom and started to receive their instruction at home and outside of the presence of a teacher. So as staff, we've been looking at what might need to change with respect to the 990 and 180 for the 2021 school year. So just wanted to let you know that the previous work that's already been completed by the board, which will help in these efforts, you'll remember that, well, some of you will remember more than others, that in 2016, the board made some amendments to R277419 to allow an LEA to use a continuing enrollment measurement other than the 10-day rule for purposes of calculating a school's student membership. What the 10-day rule is it assumes that you're attending every day. If a student misses 10 days of has 10 unexcused absences, then the LEA has to remove that student from their records or their membership roll. And so in 2016, we provided that flexibility to LEAs to use something other than a daily attendance check in order to demonstrate student enrollment in that school. And then just recently, you'll remember that the board amended R277419 to redefine some key definitions in that rule, and the definitions are attendance validated program and learner validated program, which really goes to show that we're starting to have a shift between we can have programs or membership be validated through attendance, or it could be validated through the learner's progress along either competencies or finishing projects or logging in to a system or having some face-to-face or virtual, I guess, interactions with their teachers or fellow students. So that's the work that you've already done that can support us moving to rethinking what the 180 and 990 look like moving forward. So some of the things that we're doing as staff, we've had many meetings internally to discuss this issue, and we created an internal work group of staff that includes program staff, policy staff, financial ops, data, and our IT staff, of course. So we've got a good cross-section of USBE staff kind of tracking what work is being done in this area. We also recently, a group of us met with LEA stakeholders on how they are using different continuing enrollment measurements other than a daily attendance check to support the demonstrating that they do have students that they're engaged with and that are on the rolls of their school. And that was really helpful. And we'll continue to meet with that group, especially in a moment, you'll see some of the options that we're considering and why that stakeholder group will be very important. And then the last thing we wanted to let you know is that we are going to be a few staff and probably one board member and some representatives from the governor's office and the legislature are going to participate in a workshop with Excel Ed. It's called Delinking Traditional Seat Time from State Funding in the COVID-19 era, which we're hoping to learn from some of our colleagues in other states, as well as Excel Ed, on ways that maybe we could rethink the 180 and 990. And so just right now, here's some of the options that we're considering, although it may end up being that there's something we haven't even considered yet that we end up making a recommendation to you all on in a later board meeting or committee meeting. But the 4 potential options that we are looking at right now for the 2021 school year would be, the first one would be just to maintain the current 180-990 standards, but provide guidance and support to LEAs on how to implement a continuing enrollment measurement other than attendance. And that would be potentially providing a model policy, providing guidance, FAQs, et cetera. The second would be potentially waiving the 990 hours only, but requiring LEAs to continue to provide 180 days of instruction. The third would be to redefine the 990 hours to be hours of educational services in lieu of instruction, attendance, or student time requirements. You'll remember that we made mention of that in 419 in our the waiver that we had for the time period between March 16th and July 1. We still had an expectation of them providing educational services through the end of their regular calendar year, even if that meant that they weren't doing traditional instruction. And we would bring that to you in the form of a rule. And then last might be completely redefining a new measurement for financial reporting and measuring student engagement in schools. So that's the presentation. Just mostly wanted to give you that update that staff is working on this, and we anticipate bringing recommendations to you soon. And we can provide you updates at least no later than the July board meeting.
And so we'll probably bring this up in our executive meeting, whether we put this in a committee meeting or board meeting. So thank you for it. It is a hot topic to a lot of people, and there's quite a bit of work, but of course there's still the board's work that needs to take place. That opportunity will be forthcoming. Questions, comments from board members? Board member Lear.
Thank you. I do appreciate your work, and I appreciate the creativity that must go into this. I have 2 concerns. These are just an overlay for what you're thinking. I'm sure it's nothing brand new, but important for me to say and express. As you process this, the staff processes this to bring it back to the board. I will repeat something I've said before. I feel like there's the possibility of the board being sort of caught in a trap or backed into a corner through no bad intentions, where the board is comfortable with LEA flexibility, but suddenly an accountability demand from the legislature. And I'm just very concerned that we are able to provide or have the LEAs provide services that are accountable to the board, but that are also accountable in a satisfactory process to the legislature, so that we're not in a difficult triangle. And the second concern I have is, and I saw some of this during the last few months of school that concerned me among family members, neighbors, and concerned is maybe not the right word. I'm not yet willing to just say I'm going with backpack funding. I'm not willing to say any student services gets a WPU equivalent. I think we need to look at how that how those services are maintained through the school and not just funded without as much control or direction as they have been. I still support homeschoolers' rights to be homeschooled. I just don't support their right to take funding from students who actually attend school, and I'm using air quotes because attend now has very many pictures, and I just think we need to watch what that looks like and observe that, unless we're just going to give it up altogether. Thank you, and I don't need a response. Those are my two concerns going forward. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you, Board Member Lear. Board Member Cannon. Your hand is raised, I think.
I'm sorry, I muted myself instead of unmuting myself.
Oh, there you go.
Okay. I have some concerns also, and I'm wondering if this might be perhaps a little premature. What I would like to know, based on anecdotal information that I've heard from teachers that I know about how few of their students really engaged in the online learning and really stuck it out to the end of the year, and how many students were more or less lost in the realm of online learning, and how difficult it was for parents to try to step in and fill the role of the teacher. I'm wondering, is there some intention to try to analyze or document how successful this attempt to go all online and remove face-to-face has been? Is this going to be something that we throw out the baby with the bathwater in terms of school days and instructional hours, and have something in lieu of instruction before we really know how our children fared in terms of their learning under this new scenario that we've constructed for them?
So were those concerns or questions?
Well, those are questions and concerns. If someone has any thought on, are we going to do anything to take a look at what happened and how successful it was before we start jumping into saying we're going to do this for another entire school year?
So, yeah. So do you want to answer, Deputy Superintendent Stallings, do you want to answer Board Member's question on the look back this last quarter on data regarding the online learning that LEAs were pushed into and participation? Is that part of what we'll be looking at moving forward?
Well, it's not something we've currently started looking at. I think it's a great idea. It looks like Superintendent Dixon might have something to say on this. I don't know if she's aware.
Yeah. We've actually have been looking at it, the digital teaching learning team, and we've surveyed, we've sent out surveys. So one of the things, we know a couple of things. First, we know that from digital teaching learning initiatives, we had tools that went out, and we were far ahead of other states. There were some places in remote and rural areas that they couldn't ping a cell tower, so they didn't have access to broadband. So we know that broadband is an issue, and we're really leaning in everywhere that we can to make that a principle of equity. So broadband, number one. Number two, teachers have been trained over the years in digital teaching and learning initiatives to utilize digital tools in their classroom, but that has not translated the same way into a remote setting, because in the classroom, they can control for variables that they can't control for in the home. And in the home, you might have more than one child on a device, again, a broadband issue. Parents trying to work from home and be teachers as well. It's different in terms of independence for younger kiddos versus older kiddos. So definitely we've looked at all those variables, and those have been studied, and getting feedback from superintendents, charter directors, the 4 advisory groups that I have, they've all given me feedback about it. And again, there are other ways that we've been collecting that data. So it informs what it would look like in terms of remote. It's informing what it would look like in terms of blended. And our principals and LEA leaders really are the ones who have been collecting this data, and then they inform us. I hope that helps.
Yes, thank you. Would we be able to see that data when some of these potential options might be brought to us?
I think we have it in narrative form, Board Member Cannon. I don't know that we have numbers, but we can certainly just bring forward those points and write it up in terms of where we got it from and what we know so far about the information.
Thank you.
The other piece and the data and the proposed betterments that might be for board consideration on the 180 and 990 is kind of coming from the education community that does the digital teaching and learning 24/7s and those that do it partially to better address information will be coming forth to our board to better address the accountability pieces that both board member Cannon and also board member Lear were talking about. So I'm really looking forward to more information and more data and et cetera. Board member Earl.
Thank you. I was just going to make a comment that I know that in many cases, especially those that were already in this realm, it's highly successful of what they're doing online and such. And then I know that there were many families it was very complicated to try to transition and do a normal school day at home. So I think we need to do a mix here. And I would look forward to seeing the data as well that we're acquiring so we can find where those successful moments were and allow the flexibility for others who want to move into that realm in some way to do that without putting constraints on them.
Thank you, Board Member Earl. Board Member Gravitt.
Just a couple things. I wanted to respond to Janet just anecdotally that out of about 200 students, I had about 17 that I never saw any getting online, any connection. And then I had about 34 that didn't get enough for credit. But I think talking to some of them, I think one of the obstacles is kind of what Chair Huntsman was saying, that accountability piece. And I think going forward, we've learned that perhaps, instead of just putting it out there into the, the online platforms, maybe they do get on at a certain time. There is an attendance sort of component. I think I learned that. And I think a lot of us in the education community learned that. And then also, I think one of the things we can attribute to a lot of the success was, and this is a shout out to digital teaching and learning. In my district, we did the digital teaching and learning specifically with language arts teachers. And we did that several years ago. And we were already in place. We already had our Google certifications. We'd already done that stuff. And so those of us who were prepared, it was so much more seamless, and it really wasn't a big adjustment except for that we were missing our kids. But otherwise, that was huge coming from the state board. That really benefited those of us who'd gone through that. So anyway, just a little perspective on that.
Thank you, Board Member Gravitt. I'm not seeing any other hands. So thank you, Deputy Superintendent Stallings, for bringing this topic up, and it's kind of a precursor to some more work that we'll be doing in adjusting ourselves during these, as we're sailing through these unique times. So thank you. Did that conclude your report, doesn't it? Did you have
Yes, it
anything to
does.
add, Deputy Superintendent Stallings?
It does. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, board members, I believe we've completed all of our agenda items. I want to thank you for your participation and the board's good work as we're moving this work forward. A shout out to Jeff and Lorraine for their work, and also USBE staff in the preparation. And if we look at these documents and support documents, we didn't cover all of them, but I want to just give a shout out to the staff that's listening. One thing that we're doing as leadership, we're asking staff, the USB staff, we're asking the superintendencies to reach out and continually please be aggressive. If we need to be adjusting ourselves through this, bring it to this meeting, and so you can see the evidence of their work as they're reaching out, turning over these rocks with all these statutes and rules. And so my concluding comment here is We will be meeting next week again. There's work that needs to be done. We'll have another full agenda as things are moving forward. That will be Thursday, the 18th, and we'll be starting at 1 o'clock. And we'll adjust the schedule depending on the end time, depending on how much we have to bring before the board and get board directives. So thank you for your work. That concludes this meeting, and we are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
Stay safe. Hold on, hang on. Does Board Member Lear, is your hand up for a reason?
It was. I was just wondering what time Brittany was planning on starting the audit committee meeting.
I thought it was at 4, wasn't it?
Yes, it's at 4, so 15 minutes.
Right at 4. Thank you. Bye.
Sorry. Okay. Thank you. Be safe. Take care.
Thank you, Chair.